What's going on? So, looks like it started. Hey, come on. Get up, sleepyhead.
That was some wild party. Wait, are they already cleaning up already?
Yeah. Looks like the party ended without us. Already started packing things up.
Oh, I see. I always hate it when this part happens.
Things aren't so bad. It's only the beginning of everybody packing up, so there are still gonna be a ton of decorations around the place.
They start with the little things until everything's all gone. There may still be a lot now, but they always start small.
Hey, come on, cheer up. We're still celebrating, right? So it's not over yet.
That's true. Now it's only just you and I for the fun of this little after-party story time of ours.
Here, let me tell you a little story that I found a bit ago. You're really gonna like this one. In 2001, I moved from my parents' house into the suburbs of Kansas City to a cheap apartment in the art ghetto. It was a first-floor apartment of a brownstone building, built in 1918, with all hardwood floors. It was beautiful. It had sat vacant for a year before I moved in, which didn't make sense because it was cheap and in a prime location. I happily moved into my first apartment, not realizing that the next 4 months would be hell. Moving in, I noticed several abandoned cars in the parking lot adjacent to my apartment. Didn't really think about it as I'm a bike rider until I got into my U-Haul to return it. The truck would not for anything start. After several attempts, I had it towed back to the rental place. No big deal. I began unpacking the first night, playing music to keep me company. The person upstairs began banging on the floor. So I turned the music down. Banging. I turned the music off, annoyed, and the banging continued? I figured that the apartment had sat vacant and the neighbors would eventually get used to me. The next day I arrived home from work to find my power out. After a call to the electric company, I found that all I had to do was flip the breaker in the basement. So I went down, flashlight in hand. The basement seemed to stretch for miles, and while it was summer at the time, it felt cold as winter. Got the chills and flipped the breaker. I saw my own breath in the air, freaked out, and ran up to the stairs to my apartment. When I walked into my apartment, all of my electrical stuff was on. Stereo, TV, microwave, even a curling iron in the bathroom. And my neighbor was banging again as I turned everything off, thinking it was a fluke from the breaker switch. I quickly forgot about the chilly basement as I hurried around turning everything off. My neighbor continued to bang until around 11 o'clock. I went to bed, annoyed by the situation. At 2 in the morning, I awoke to what sounded like something rolling on my ceiling. I listened for a while, then put a pillow over my head. The next couple of weeks were uneventful. except the neighbors banging and the rolling noise from time to time at night. I was tired, yes, but I was having a good time decorating my apartment. I invited friends over for a small housewarming party. It all started out well, but my friends started commenting on the noises the people upstairs were making. So I'd had enough. I went upstairs to confront my neighbor. A little old man opened the door. He kindly invited me in, seeming very sweet. I introduced myself, feeling awkward, and then politely asked him about the banging. He told me he didn't know what I was talking about. I described the noises, and he assured me he wasn't making them. Confused, I went back to my place. When I walked in, all my friends were huddled into a corner of my living room. My girlfriend Sarah was crying, obviously upset. I asked her what was going on, and she told me that she had gone to use the restroom, and while she was washing her hands, she saw a face in the mirror for a second. "I'm not a believer in ghosts," she said, "but I swear I saw one in the mirror. It was a bloody woman, and she looked terrifying." Okay, party over. We calmed Sarah down and decided to call it a night. Between my neighbors still making noise and Sarah's ghost encounter, my party was a bust. Sarah was the first to leave. She had parked in the street. My two other friends had parked in the parking lot behind my building. Neither of their cars would start. Thinking it was some prank from neighborhood kids, we called AAA. And the mechanic came out, but couldn't find anything wrong with either car. And ultimately had the cars towed. My friends took cabs home since they had to work in the morning. Depressed, I tried to fall asleep. And finally managed, after hours and hours of tossing and turning to the noise in my ceiling. Arriving home the next day, I decided to confront my neighbor again. He asked me to direct him to the part of my apartment the noise was coming from, and so I invited him downstairs. Okay, two things. When we walked into my place, my phone rang. One of my friends was calling to tell me about his car, and nothing was wrong with it. As soon as it got towed, it started just fine. He said the same thing happened to my other friend. No joke, no prank. The cars were fine. As I hung up my phone, the banging started on my ceiling again. My petless neighbor was standing right next to me, and he wasn't making any noise at all. He looked just as confused as me. I asked him about the rolling noises, and his face got all pinched up for a minute. He invited me back up to his place for coffee and a story. In my neighbor's apartment, I sat down and listened. He told me that he used to be friends with the girl that used to live in my apartment. But wasn't my place vacant for a year? I asked. Sure, he said. After the accident. He told me he had become friends with a girl living in my unit after seeing her bruised and limping a few times. He started getting his mail at the same time, leaving it at the same time, etc. And eventually, they became friends. She had a terribly abusive boyfriend. My neighbor told me that she finally confessed that her boyfriend had tied her to a wheelchair a few times and cut her power in the dead of the winter. Her boyfriend left her there, leaving for his job as a driver for a wealthy lady downtown. My neighbor said that she told him that all she could do when that happened was wheel around, knocking into things, hoping someone would find her, hoping her boyfriend would come home and untie her. My neighbor said she broke down in tears, promising to never see the boyfriend again. And she didn't. For a while. He said they were good friends during that time, eating dinner together and watching TV together. Gifts and flowers flooded the apartment building for a couple of months before she went back to her boyfriend. My neighbor said that they weren't friendly after that. She chose to end the friendship, not the relationship. My neighbor got a really weird look on his face when I asked him what happened to the girl. And finally, he responded. I hadn't seen her for a week. I called the police, and they found her in the basement, tied to a wheelchair, and a knife still in her side. I went back to my place in disbelief. Am I hearing the former tenant wheeling around in her prison? Had my friend seen her in the mirror? Did this have anything to do with cars not being able to start? I was asking all those questions when all of a sudden the power to my place switched off. I called my parents and had them come and pick me up. There was no way I was going to stay there after that. After a few days of sleeping on my parents' couch, I became brave enough to start researching what my neighbor told me. The story, it seemed, matched up. A girl had indeed been found murdered in my basement. The police never found her boyfriend, and the police responded to a missing persons report made by the girl's father. I was freaked out. Started calling my landlord, trying to get out of my lease. They weren't very respondent. About a month after landing on my parents' couch, I was still couch surfing. I needed clothes and some other stuff from my place. I lost my job in the process, showing up late and tired. Even in the safety of my parents' house, the girl's story plagued me while I slept. The only people who seemed to believe me were Sarah and my neighbor. Everyone else thought I was being superstitious. I returned to my apartment one evening, feeling a little silly for having been scared off. Keep in mind, I hadn't been there for a month. I walked in to my entire place being turned on again. Microwave, stove, TV, stereo, and curling iron smoking against a towel. Seems I made it home in time to watch my place nearly burn. I turned everything off and the knocking began. Scared again, I went up to talk to my neighbor. But he didn't answer the door, and I decided to finally confront my landlord. I walked 2 blocks to the leasing office, going over what I was going to say. My landlord apologized about the apartment situation. He agreed to let me do a transfer free of charge because of the murder. Thanks. As I was filling out paperwork, we started talking about the scary stuff happening at my place. And when I began talking about my neighbor, the landlord point blank told me no one was living above me currently. What? Game over. Apparently the girl's father had been living in the unit above me until a month before I moved in. My landlord said he was grieving, losing his daughter, but refused to move. Grief, time, old age, it all caught up to him, my landlord said. He lived for a month in the hospital and his heart just gave out. Had to happen sooner or later. I threw the papers at my landlord, telling him I would not transfer to another unit. I'd move back in with my parents. Thank you. And I ran out of there like somebody was chasing me. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't necessarily believe in ghosts. But apparently, I lived with them once. I never saw the girl, but I spoke to her father. And I listened to her, wheeling around at night and banging on things during the day. And believe me, it's enough to make me a believer. Enough of one to make my friends clean out my apartment for me anyway. Even when I try to make sense of it all, or debunk it, I keep going back to the girl's poor father. Did I ever even drink my neighbor's coffee? I don't know. I just never went back. So, what you think?
Yeah, okay. That was a good one. But wasn't really scaring me like usual with your stories.
You just keep telling yourself that.
Come on. I think we've been here long enough. Besides, I think they're mostly done with cleaning now by the looks of it.
Okay, I'm fine with that. Though, I still want to hear what you got for me this time.
Relax. I'll tell you my little tale on our way out of here. We can do two things at once. Anyway, it goes like this. This story isn't about me, but about my younger sister. She never lies, and I truly believe her story. We used to live in a house in Southampton, England, that was newly built, and we were the first people to live there. Only thing was, we lived right next to a very old graveyard. Our garden had an 8-foot hedge, and a grave was on the other side. My sister and I used to share a room, but almost every night, my sister would go into my parents' room, saying that she was too scared to sleep in her room. My mum asked why, and she told her that an old lady would wake her up and scare her. She was only around 3 to 5 years old at the time. My mum put it down to an overactive imagination. Anyways, years later, we moved to another house, and my sister and I were on the subject of ghosts, and I reminded her about the old lady that used to wake her up and scare her. She told me that she wasn't making it up. She would wake up in the middle of the night, every night, to see an old lady sitting on the end of her bed. The old lady wore a blue dress and white cardigan. She was thin and had short, white, curly hair. My sister also remembers that she had a blue and purple brooch attached to her cardigan. She looked as real as a normal person, except she had a silvery white glow around her, which is why my sister could see her so clearly in the dark. The creepiest thing about the whole thing is that my sister would be woken up by the old lady physically stroking her foot. The lady would then tell my sister everything was going to be okay, and she would look after her. Shocked by this, I asked what she did in response, to which my sister replied, "I legged her into Mom and Dad's room." I don't blame her. Even though I shared a room with my sister, I never saw the old lady, nor was ever woken up by my sister's legging it out of our room. We moved when my sister was around 5, and the old lady never came with us. So we guess she was possibly buried in the graveyard, and still haunts the old house to this very